Sonic Super Special Issue 11. We start out with Sally going to become one with the source of all because Elise didn't want to be the next king. As she goes under the liquid and I wonder how she can breathe under there, Sally feels herself drawn to the light as if by magic, and to her mother, who she remembers wishing that she would never see another war. This was when she was a baby, so the source of all is giving her the ability to remember all the way back then. That was nice of it. Then she remembers her mother figure Jalila telling her that it's necessary to defeat the Overlanders, and surprisingly, we see the king talking to Sally, probably because his crown connects him to the source of all at all times, and after he says that she'll need to make some harder, more ruthless decisions later on, and after we see some pointless talking between her and for some reason Elias as well, even though Elias isn't in the source of all, Sally sees herself as a future queen, and is told that her father, from being connected to the source of all, is fully aware of the consequences of every action he would take. Why wasn't he aware that Robotnik would overthrow him then? It's talking as if this so grants omniscience, but you'd think if the source of all was able to show her Mobius 20 years later, it would have warned the king about Robotnik. We see Queen Sonic and Sally in a castle being attacked by a war, and Sonic tells her to take the kids and run, just like her father had done. Only he should be way more capable of handling himself in such a situation. Sally's then told that she won't be told what happens to Sonic 20 years later because she hasn't completed her becoming one with the source of all. And then Sally says that she's not sure she wants to know everything in order to become queen, and decides not to do it. Granted, this might be because she thinks knowing everything would make her less human, or less squirrel person, I guess. But this seems like a really stupid decision to me. There's so much more she'd know. She's basically giving up being psychic. Although again, giant plot hole here. The king should have known Robotnik's plan to overthrow him if he was this omniscient, and Sally should have pointed that out as yet another huge flaw with the source of all. Why would she give this up? You'd think she'd want to do everything it takes to be the best queen possible, especially with her insecurity, self-doubt, and perfectionism. But I guess not. They're basically having the writer possess her body and force her to say no to avoid making her too overpowered. Then why even introduce this concept? And Elias is a supportive brother by hugging her and agreeing with her decision, although you think the hug would be pretty awkward considering she's got no clothes on, which had been awkward in general throughout the story. The next story has Hershey being told by Jeffrey that it's not too late and she can take point, whatever that means. I guess it means do his job, while he goes crawling around the dragon's den instead. Hershey then arbitrarily insists that she can do this, and says that Jeffrey can't possibly supervise every mission, naturally since at some point a mission will require that every single person is off doing their own thing. And again with the 9 lives, she's saying it as if she's serious, but she still gets worried about the mission going wrong. She worries about drawing attention, and is thankful that the Eggman didn't hear her land. The way they introduced the Eggman nickname is just so awkward and forced and stilted, it comes out of nowhere. It'd be fine if they were using that as a nickname to insult him, like, since the comic began, or we see Eggman being told by the roboticized General Decollette that a radical is doing his best to frustrate him, and Eggman says he'll dispatch reinforcements. Then Hershey talks to her wristwatch to Jeffrey when I assume she's right in earshot of Eggman. Well, I guess not, since he couldn't hear her. But that reminds me of when Rouge did the same thing in SA2. With that, an explosion happens in Robotropolis, with Jeffrey being seen overlooking it, and Eggman orders some shadow SWAT bots to put out the fire. Hershey thinks unhappily that that didn't do the trick, and then wonders if the threat was more local. She presses a button to set a landmine, and I think Eggman hears her, but fortunately he didn't activate the security codes for some reason. She accesses the database regards to Valdez and then tells Jeffrey the news, with the issue ending off with an explosion that I'm not sure how it accomplishes anything. But at least she gets to do something as an elite for the first time. The next story, in the Western Flats, brings us back to the Wolf Pack, with one of them saying that returning home wasn't the best choice because all they see are the devastated ruins of their old city thanks to Robotnik. Lupe says that while they may not find their loved ones here, there's always the possibility of finding out where they've gone. Lupe insists that Lobo would never leave without leaving a sign for her. Is she in denial about him potentially being roboticized? Does she just not know about Eggman being around? Then a missile creates some sleeping gas near the wolf pack, and they wake up seeing Lupe's husband and kids roboticized. And shockingly, Uncle Chuck, who lost his free will, has been made a top villain here, threatening the wolf pack to do what they're told or else the children will be turned into scrap metal. Again shockingly, Lupe gets roboticized, but keeps her free will for long enough to attack some robots and help her friends escape for some reason. But then says that it's getting hard for her to think and she just wants to be with her family again. Well, this is depressing. I gotta say I'm shocked. I then see a symbolic tombstone to Lupe. Wow, you're giving up hope real fast. And I misread hero as nerd multiple times because of the way the font is. Then we see Bunny confusingly unconscious with some doctors tending to her. They say that her life signs are finally stabilizing, but her metabolism is still haywire because her bionics and nervous system are incompatible all of a sudden. And after she collapses carrying something heavy in front of Antoine, the doctors say that all they can do is tell her to rest. What's going on? This comes out of nowhere. Bunny is given some privacy with the doctor, who tells her, while confusingly being confused that this hasn't happened to her earlier, that she has conflicting operating systems. Her bionics no longer work reliably with her central nervous system. Is this because she doesn't have a roboticized brain? This really does feel forced and come out of nowhere. The doctor explains that as her bionics continue to inexplicably deteriorate, with Nate somehow not being able to do anything to help, eventually her bionics will shut down and become toxic to the organic part of her body, which also makes no sense, as if they could be toxic, why weren't they that way before? It's as if Bunny's body was at war with itself, determined to be either all organic or all robotic. This practically made me wonder if this was another nightmare of hers. If this is something cyborgs can easily go through, why has this never even been hinted at as a potential problem for them? Bunny's told that she has three options. She can disconnect her robotic limbs from her body, upgrade her hardware with no possibility of ever being deroboticized, or chancing a deroboticization process after all the modifications where the odds of her survival are pretty much nothing. Naturally, Bunny tells him to leave and starts to cry, and Antoine is a good comforting boyfriend and gives her a hug. And then immediately, Nate fixes her problem, getting rid of all the things she was worried about. Well then, I can't believe Dr. Quack didn't think of that. It really feels like this story was just an arbitrary excuse to get Bunny to cry and get a hug from Antoine. Then we go into a hopefully better story where Julie Stu thinks about how she needs to know her past. Or does she have amnesia? It makes sense of her character to want to keep that potential weakness a secret. She thinks that her visor readout shows the complex dead ahead, and in the next page I honestly can barely read the pink text blurb. I could only assume that it's calling that complex of hers and her old home. I'm really worried about her getting in trouble with her friends right now, because if they find her here and don't know why she's here, they'll get pretty suspicious. She wonders if this building hasn't been seen by anyone since Knuckles fought Kragok, and hopes she'll find what she's looking for. She sees her room in the living quarters completely trashed, and starts to remember and reminisce about her past in the Dark Legion. I'm really interested in seeing this actually. For some reason, she always felt like Kragok and his second-in-command, Commissar, were constantly watching her. Commissar mentions in the flashback that they'd be better off if her father had simply jettisoned her out of an airlock years ago. Well then, I didn't know she was so unappreciated. Then Julie hears a door sliding open the present day in the armory, where she had once been outfitted with a taser before Knuckles hit the scene. She takes advantage of that memory to get herself a taser for a precaution. And after hearing someone rummaging around in an office, she activates a security shield. I'm not sure what happened in this next panel. And then she questions a weird-looking cyborg who looks like he's high on who he is and what he's doing. The cyborg, named Simon, says that Kragok kept him from seeing her, and he had known her since she was an infant. Once they had learned that she had returned from wherever, Simon and his wife, I guess, really wanted to see her again. It turns out he's her adoptive father, who she doesn't actually remember. Over 30 years ago, in Dark Legion time, Rex's son Luger took a bride, and she bore him Kragok and Leanda as twins. Wait a minute. Didn't the Knuckles comic with Tober in it say that Kragok's father was Rex, not some guy named Luger? Well, this is certainly a retcon. When the children were roughly 8, the portal between the Twilight Cage and the floating island arbitrarily opened up for no reason, But unfortunately, the environment would prove inhospitable to Kragok's mother for some reason, giving her a fever which she somehow still died from even after she and everyone else for some reason went back to the Twilight Cage. If a Dark Legionnaire can catch a fatal illness from going out of the Twilight Cage, why hasn't this happened to anyone else? Are the conditions in the Twilight Cage really that different despite still being equally inhabitable? Did she have a really bad immune system? Several years later, Kragok's father recovered from his loss, meeting a woman literally called Mary Sue, but with an I instead of a Y. Unfortunately, Kragok and Leanda, 16 years old by this point, viewed her as a threat to their own ambitions for some weird reason, while showing the natural reaction from a kid to their parents remarrying, which is kind of relatable. Mary and the father of Kragok were Julie Sue's parents. I knew she was related to Kragok. That's why she was allowed to go so long without a black cloak after she got rid of hers, and that's why she sat up front, right next to him in the UFO. I used to think she was Kragok's daughter, but considering she never called him her dad, it does make more sense that they're half-siblings instead. It had broken Simon's heart to see Julie so badly wanting to play with her half-brother and sister only to be shunned and ignored and rejected, because they didn't want her to exist in the first place. What's worse is that after Julie's mother died in an accident, providing Kragok to say good riddance, Kragok's father didn't know how to raise a kid when he didn't have the time, so he entrusted Julie Sue to Florence, and then it's implied that he was killed off by Kragok himself, and there wasn't any discontent among the ranks at Kragok succeeding him in power. I guess they all really respected him. And since Kragok and Leanda had no desire to involve Julie in their affairs, despite, letting her sit right up front with Kragok when Enerjak was invading Incantopolis, they activated a memory neutralizing chip that every Dark Legionnaire interestingly has installed upon birth. It must be pretty unnerving and terrifying for the parents that every baby is forced to have this put in them by the government. And I just remembered what happened to High Counselor Pravda when the brainwashing chip in his brain shorted out. He was turned into a coma patient. So wouldn't that make every Dark Legionnaire vulnerable to that if their memory chip shorted out too? Kragok ordered people to tell Julie that she was just an orphan and that Simon's wife was the only parental figure she ever knew. Because Simon worked directly under Rex as his aide, Kragok and Leanda thought he wouldn't fear them for some reason. So they reassigned him to lead an infantry unit on supply raids to get rid of him, but somehow even that wasn't enough. And so they took Julie away from Florence, who had for 8 years been the daughter she never had. Why are they doing this? I don't understand. Julie learns that her memory had been erased of that as well, as I wonder how the Dark Legion hasn't erased her memory yet again after she defected if they can just remotely do a mind wipe on her whenever they want. Did someone destroy something to prevent that from ever happening to her again? Simon explains that when they discovered she was alive and well, he came here to gather evidence for her benefit. What evidence? I don't understand. Julie says that if he really was with the Legion, he would have known that she was always around, and Simon explains that shortly after they'd taken her, the portal opened again. That's when he made the decision to take his wife and settle on the floating island. With that, Julie happily decides to go home to see his wife, finally giving herself some parents. Well, this certainly was a lot of exposition. I thought we'd get an actual story about her doing stuff in the Dark Legion. But it's nice to see her backstory. This issue was written by Ken Penders, and it is nice to see an issue dedicated to some female characters for a change, but some of the stories seemed dedicated to making them miserable, with Lupe having the absolute worst happen to her, which really wasn't led up to naturally at all, while Bunny came pretty close as well with something horrible happening regarding her bionics inexplicably becoming incompatible with her. Her situation felt very forced, coming out of nowhere, as if the only reason it happened with the doctor somehow not thinking to just consult Nate right away was to have an excuse to have Antoine comfort her. It should have been obvious that Nate could have helped her from the start. And he fixes the problem so easily, what was the point? You'd expect a story about Bunny would have her doing something useful, but I guess not. They'll go to any lengths to not let her take advantage of her robot parts. And even on the rare occasion she does, I take it for granted and just get reminded of how it doesn't happen way more often. Hershey's story was basically pointless, having her find out about Valdez's fate without finding out his intriguing, supposedly turning against her friends, and leaving an explosion for Eggman that we don't know how useful it even was. And Sally's story has a giant plot hole introduced by the source of all saying that it can show people every consequence of their actions. because now wondering why the king didn't know that his hiring Robotnik was a mistake. This was totally unnecessary, and it has Sally inexplicably decide not to gain the knowledge she'd get from the source of all, even though you'd think she'd want to do everything possible to be the best queen she could be. All in all, the story was just a disappointment, doing nothing but making most of the girls either suffer or waste time. Next up is Sonic Super Special Issue 12.